So, and still am at all times. All right. So let me find the notes, because I thought we had already done that. Okay, I don't want to cry in front of you, but I might. Oh, there they are. Okay. Okay. I didn't open it the right way, so I can't share it. Oh, dang. I'm glad I started recording just in time so everybody could see that I couldn't figure out how to share stuff. All right, thanks. I appreciate it. All right, thankfully I do know something about history. Oh my gosh, technology. I know I've probably already told you, but I have we all have parents. So I was gonna say I have a dad, you guys do as well. So my he'll be 80 on his next birthday, and he makes fun of my technology skills. He has an online job, so which says something about his retirement planning, to be honest. But he's so much better with technology than me and makes fun of me a lot. So here we go. I do know more about, I don't know. Maybe I don't know more about it. Right. So we talked last time, general stuff about Reconstruction, and I feel like we covered all of this stuff on the first page of these notes. And so today the plan really is to kind of go over a lot of this content. And then next time the plan will be probably to talk a little bit more directly about your weekly question, which is, was Reconstruction successful or not? And of course the answer is always yes, it was and it wasn't. So, and we may have talked about sharecropping and the crop lien system. Excuse me. So I'll just remind you that most people's jobs during this time period were agriculturally based. So that's true in the North, true in the South. It's less likely to be true in the North, but it's still pretty true in the North. And in the South, it's really, really, really true. And if you don't own land, but you need to work as a farmer, you have some issues. So you're going to end up being what they call the sharecropper, which is like a tenant farmer, sort of, or a migrant farmer. I know my husband's family were migrant farmers, and they, traveled wherever the crops were and picked the stuff, occasionally planted the stuff, but they mostly picked stuff. And, but this is a little more, you stay in the same place. So in the South, all you do pretty much in this era is grow cotton. So you work on someone else's cotton farm, and you don't have any land. So you work for them, and then you share in the proceeds of the crop. So once the crop comes in, then you are, the notes are on course documents. You scroll all the way to the bottom. That's where they are. Okay. So you share somebody else's land, you share in the crop, but until the crop comes in, you might borrow money from the landowner to, for tools or food or rent or whatever else it is you need. And then when the crop comes in, he pays you, excuse me, and then pays off your debts as well. And you're probably perpetually in debt to this landowner. They're going to pass a whole bunch of laws in the South that say that you have to have a labor contract, especially if you're a former slave, for a year. And then if you get into debt to the landowner, then you can't go work for anyone else. So it really creates a new system that's very much like slavery. The difference, of course, is going to be no one technically owns you, even though they do control a lot of things about you. You get to pick where you live, and nobody can sell you family. So, I mean, there's definitely improvements, but it's still, you don't have a lot of economic freedom, which is a consistent issue. And you guys already, I mean, I'm not going to compare being poor to being a slave, but I mean, just from your life experience, that if you struggle to pay for stuff, that you don't have as much autonomy or freedom as you would like to have. I mean, that's just kind of. So in this system of sharecropping, if you don't have a whole lot of control over who you work for, how they treat you, then you're going to get stuck in a job where you're treated poorly and paid poorly and that sort of thing. Now, crop lien system, similar, I suppose, in some ways, except you own land, but you're really broke. And so you may or may not have enough money to buy the seed or the materials that you need to plant the crop, the tools, things like that, or you may not have enough money for your living expenses. So you're going to have to borrow against the value of your land to put in the crop. And then when the crop comes in, you pay back the loan, and then hopefully you'll have some profits. This system, you're just kind of on that edge of solvency financially, so it's really tricky. And if you have one crop failure, then the bank is going to repossess your land, and then you're going to end up being a sharecropper. So crop lien systems borrowing against the value of your land, and then probably, you know, within 5 to 10 years, you're going to be in the sharecropping position. So unless you have a really good crop and you manage your money well and kind of get above. So things are, I don't know, it's tricky being poor in the South. And there's not as many, I mean, not that it's not that it's a whole lot better being poor in the North, but your best financial opportunities in the South are related to farming. So if you don't own land in the South, it's going to be very hard for you to get ahead. There are a few urban centers in the South, but, you know, we could count them on 2 hands. So, you know, you're not going to have very many opportunities to start businesses, to live, darn it, with the phone, to live in the city and do well. Your financial well-being is going to be tied to owning land. That's a little less true in the North, where you might be able to have a small business or something along those lines. I'm not saying they didn't have small businesses in the South. I'm just saying almost everything. There's more diverse economy. Okay. All right, so we've talked already about Andrew Johnson being the vice president in the 1860 election as a member of the Constitutional Union Party. And, you know, we're going to bind up the wounds of the North and the South. And this was kind of a conciliatory measure from Abraham Lincoln to the South, saying, look, you've suffered enough. We're going to put the one guy loyal to the Union as vice president, and then, you know, we'll be nice to you as we can, because you guys got torn up in the war and that sort of thing. So we're going to reward him for his loyalty to the Union, and he's just vice president anyway. How much could it possibly matter? And then, of course, Lincoln gets killed. So once Lincoln gets killed, and Andrew Johnson, Lincoln chooses Andrew Johnson on purpose, which seems like a bad choice in retrospect. The guy in second place being vice president, that did happen for the first couple of elections, but, you know, when you had Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Johnson in there, did I just say that? I did, I'm sorry. When you had Thomas Jefferson and John Adams in there at the same time, they fought against each other. One was president, one was vice president, and that was in the vice president, second place gets to be vice president days. That was such a mess that they end up changing that with constitutional amendment and some other stuff to make sure that we have a ticket. So by this time you have a ticket, so you get a president and vice president. They try it one time where they're not exactly on a ticket, but you try to arrange electoral votes to where vice presidential candidate gets one fewer than the presidential candidate, but then you ended up with that Jefferson Burr ticket, and then Alexander Hamilton gets in the mix, and then you get a musical. Well, no, you get the musical later, but Aaron Burr ends up shooting Alexander Hamilton in part over that. And so they said, no, we just can't do that anymore. So sorry, much longer discussion than I know you wanted about that. So back to chapter 15, apologies. So Johnson is president. Now, the Congress had already indicated their desire to to ban former Confederate officials from being part of the newly reunited Union government. And a lot of those Confederate officials will go to Andrew Johnson, the new president, and ask for pardon between the time that Lincoln's inauguration and the time Congress is actually seated and starts their next congressional session. So when Andrew Johnson lets all of these people back in, Congress comes back in session, and they refuse to allow these new representatives to take the oath of office. And they assert that it's their power to create the new Reconstruction plan, that it's not the president's prerogative to decide who gets to be a congressman or a senator, that Congress gets to make that it's a legislative decision, not an executive decision, you know, the different powers of the government. And of course, we have no idea, because it doesn't say necessarily in the Constitution, how do we put the Union back together, because no one really anticipated the Union falling apart. Just like, you know, is it really constitutional to not allow these states to leave the Union, because no one envisioned this happening. So we've got a whole bunch of legal issues in the midst of, you know, political crisis as well, in the midst of the end of a civil war. So nobody has a lot of answers, but there are lots of conflicts. So the legislative branch, the Congress, decides we're just not going to seat these people. So they end up passing Reconstruction Acts. Now, I'm definitely not going to ask you a question about whose Reconstruction Act was whose, but when Lincoln was discussing a Reconstruction Act, so it's before, it's after his election, or right about the time of his election, but before the next Congress comes into session. They're trying to decide, how do we let the South back in? Lincoln wants to do something called a 10% plan. So his plan is, we'll just have 10% of the legislators swear allegiance to the Union, and if they're willing to do that, then we'll let the state come back in and they can operate the way that they did before the Civil War. Now, Congress is not in the mood for that. You know, we're just at the end of the Civil War. A bunch of people have died. We've spent billions of billions, no, probably millions, because, you know, no inflation yet. Millions of dollars on this war. There's been death, destruction, carnage. It's terrible. It's ripped the country in half. They're not ready to be that conciliatory. So they developed something called the Wade-Davis plan, which says that 50% of the legislators, incoming legislators, had to swear to something they call an ironclad oath, which says that they never voluntarily supported the Confederacy. And until that can happen, then you can't even have an election. So let me try again. 50% of the voters, not the legislators, 50% of the voters had to swear that they never voluntarily supported the Confederacy before that state could even have an election. Well, it's the South. It's not possible that 50% of the voters are going to be able to swear to that, because we haven't passed the 15th Amendment yet. So, you know, former slaves, they definitely were not in favor of the Civil War. So if you added them as voters, yes, but we haven't done that yet. So the Wade-Davis plan is passed by the Congress, but then Lincoln does something called a pocket veto, which doesn't happen very often because it just can't for a variety of reasons. But pocket veto is where at the end of a legislative sessions, like the last 10 days or 2 weeks, I think it's 10 work days. If the Congress signs a bill and the president disagrees with it, if he doesn't want to just legitimately veto it, like give it the stamp and say like, no, I reject this law, he can do something called a pocket veto where he doesn't sign it and then the bill just expires. Now, if you do that any time other than the last 10 days of the legislative session, if the president doesn't sign it, it becomes law. At the end of a legislative session, the rules change a little, and then the president can kind of let it quietly expire by not signing it. And if you're wondering, like, why in the world, one, to confuse you on a government test, and two, because the thought is at the end of a legislative session, tempers are pretty high, emotions are running pretty large, and people are more likely to do something less rational just to either get it done or because they're frustrated or because they're angry. So the pocket veto is an idea, I believe, to allow cooler heads to prevail. And that's what Lincoln wanted to do. He said, you know what? It's a difficult time. We're in a bad situation. We're probably going to make some irrational judgments at this point. So what we should do is quietly let this expire. We'll go home. We'll have holidays with our families. We'll start a new year. We'll get refreshed. We'll get a new Congress with a new perspective. They'll come back, and then we'll do this in a more rational way. Well, of course, Lincoln doesn't come back at all, so that, clearly turns out to be a problem. Not obviously for Lincoln, but for the country as well, most likely. I mean, sort of depends on your opinion, but I don't know very many people who think that Andrew Johnson was a much better president than Abraham Lincoln would have been in his second term. So we come back, we've got all this turmoil, and then immediately Andrew Johnson and Congress start fighting. Congress passes something called the Military or Congressional Reconstruction Act. And this is the one, if it comes up on a quiz, and I'll put your list of things to study either tonight or tomorrow, because I did finish the quiz over the weekend. I wasn't completely, soccer tournamenting and lazy, but I'll post your study list tonight or tomorrow. But if I ask you about a Reconstruction plan, I know that it's this one, because this is the one that's actually enacted. The Congressional Reconstruction, I think it's 1867 is the date. I will rarely ask you dates about anything. If I do, I'll tell you ahead of time, like, you sure you know this date? This definitely is not one of them. So military reconstruction or congressional reconstruction does what it says here, which I know you're going like, well, you just talked. Divides the South into 5 military districts that are governed by governors chosen by the North or the Union. And those states are not able to hold elections until they ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments, which have passed in the meantime. And you may or may not recall, and you will want to know the amendments. Always, if we add some amendments, I'm going to ask you about those. But the 14th Amendment is citizenship and equal protection under the law for all citizens. So it really is to enable former slaves to become citizens. And the 15th Amendment is to enable former slaves to vote. So 15th Amendment is voting rights. So until the South allows Black men to be citizens and vote, then they don't get to elect their own representatives to send to Washington, D.C. That's going to be distressing to them, and that's going to kind of cause them to push back even more against the 14th and 15th Amendments. So they will start locally enacting some things that counteract the 14th and 15th Amendments. And these things, the group of them sometimes are referred to as Jim Crow laws or Black codes, but these are separate restrictions on freedom for African Americans, for former slaves. And in some states, Louisiana is always the example that we use because, I don't know, they keep better records. It's easy. We don't want to use Texas as an example. They just changed what they had. They had a list of something called slave codes, and they literally just write a line through slave and then put Black. So Black codes. And this restricts their travel. So they may not be able to travel at night through certain cities without a white escort, all kinds of weird stuff that you'd probably be surprised, or no, you probably wouldn't be surprised by, would you? They have to have employment contracts for each year. If you don't sign a labor contract, then you get arrested for vagrancy, and then you're forced to sign a labor contract. So you can end up working for someone you don't want to work for. And it works kind of the way, not a great analogy, but the old like movie systems or professional sports, where the people who own the teams or the movie studios would make deals with each other. It's like, you hire this guy, we won't hire him as long as you let us pay this guy. So the people who owned the businesses made arrangements about who could get jobs where and who couldn't, and they held with those deals. So if you had a bad employer, but he's the only person that offers you a labor contract, you had to work for him. So this is also why, as time goes along, you will end up seeing African American men, especially if they're going to have gainful employment, starting their own businesses, and that's tricky to do for a variety of reasons, almost all financial, but some of them legal as well, because you have to have certain legal agreements to have a business. But it causes huge labor restrictions and financial difficulty for African American men especially. Now, if you're thinking, well, what about African American women? Their life's not any easier. I'm not suggesting that at all. But white men were much more likely to hire Black women, and that didn't always go well either. But it was easier for Black women to get jobs in some ways. And I was going to say in some ways safer, but that's not true. It was equally as dangerous, but for different reasons. But labor contracts required 1 year of employment, and then a lot of times the business owners would conspire together to keep you from switching jobs. Also, if you're in any debt, they pass laws that say you can't switch jobs. Okay. Now, I think sometimes when we look at this time period, and I'll stop in about 5 minutes to give you guys a little break and for me to take roll, but I think sometimes when we look at this time period, we think to ourselves, the South is really like horribly racist and cruel. And I would say that's, it's a generalization that probably works. You've studied this time period, but the North, things are better. Okay, no, I'm just going to go with no really quickly. The difference between how the North and the South treats African Americans, honestly, my impression from years of study is it would be the same if there were more African Americans in the North, because when you do see very few instances of African Americans moving from the South to the North, then the North treats them like crap as well. So, and you see, I mean, you can study this period, you'll read a little bit about it, but you'll see that the North is not very immigrant friendly. You'll see that. And different groups of immigrants are going to be treated very, very poorly as they enter. And there's a variety of explanations that we'll talk about why that happens. None of them will justify it. They'll certainly explain it. But when you see African Americans occasionally relocate from the South to the North, you end up with race riots. And if there are successful sections of town for African Americans, they get looted or burned down, or you see the same sorts of things on a smaller scale that you would see in the South, lynchings, things like that. But you see them on a smaller scale because the African American population, I think in part it's because they're blaming, I don't know. I was going to say, I think it is in part that they're blaming slavery or former slaves for the war. But my impression from, years of study of why people in the North opposed slavery, it wasn't their system. I mean, because you can see all sorts of evidence, written and otherwise, that people in the North were equally as racist as people in the South. And I don't know, I think I'm just old enough and cynical enough, although I'm basically a happy person, but I'm cynical enough to think that there's just something about human nature that causes us to dislike whoever it is that's different than us until we, let our guard down and get to know people who are different and go like, not really that different. But I mean, boy, is the Civil War mainly about business? Gosh. Yeah. We wouldn't have had, this is tricky. I'm just saying, I don't think we would have had a civil war if it weren't for slavery. So I would never say that the Civil War isn't about slavery. And I also want to qualify my statement a little bit because, oh gosh, I don't want to make the news either. But here's the thing. The people who really wanted to end slavery in the North, those folks were 100% serious about that. And for whatever reason, they had a lot of political influence, and one of them became the president. So I'm not suggesting to you that Lincoln didn't care about ending slavery. He truly did. And that Frederick Douglass, oh my gosh, or William Lloyd Garrison, or all of the abolitionists in the North, John Brown, who I know was a little crazy, but still fairly committed, those folks really wanted to end slavery, and they saw it as an evil that had to be eradicated. They did. And I know some of you going, but Lincoln in his early days, I know, but he changed his mind. Read the second inaugural address. And these people really thought slavery was the thing. I'm just saying, like, the average person drafted in the North to fight in the Civil War probably could have cared less about whether we had slavery, we didn't have slavery. They just didn't like the South. The South was different. The South was messing stuff up. They maybe didn't like the system of slavery because the South used it. But you'll see evidence in writing that probably the average person in the North and the South, equally racist. I do think people in the North were okay with ending slavery because they knew it would hurt the South. But it's so much more complicated, just like everything in life is, than the North opposed slavery and the South favored it. Most people in the South didn't have slaves, but a lot of people in the South thought someday they would have slaves, so they wanted to preserve the institution of slavery. Plus, oh my goodness. No, I'm sorry, that's funny, yeah. But it is tricky to talk about causes and effects of the Civil War because it really is complicated. But the people that we honor for their commitment to ending slavery as a part of the Civil War, those people were legit. I mean, they were. I don't want you to leave this lecture being depressed and thinking Frederick Douglass was a scam. Definitely not. Or Abraham Lincoln just said he opposed slavery so he'd get reelected. No, those guys were sincere. And if you look more at the cabinet members that Abraham Lincoln picked, you'll notice those guys were committed, serious abolitionists. And you'll also notice if you look at abolition, almost all of the abolitionists, because almost everybody in the United States was this way, were religious people. So these people, like, when Frederick Douglass talks about why abolition has to happen and why slavery is immoral, he talks about, would God want you to treat your mother the way that this slave owner treated my mother? And he talks about how can you be a Christian and think slavery is okay, because you wouldn't want to treat creation of God or someone made in the image of God in the way that slave owners treat slaves. So, but also the people who thought slavery was a good idea thought they were religious as well. So all this, it's all so complicated. But Quakers, of course, and Mennonites and people who of that sort of religious belief were really big on the Underground Railroad. So I don't know. It's just tricky. It is. Everything about history is complicated because it's a bunch of people and people are complicated. So, goodness. All right, I got excited there, didn't I? But the South, back to the South. All right, that's funny. I'm enjoying your conversation about me getting fired, though. Thank you. I appreciate the support. So the South is trying to keep African Americans in restricted territory and to keep them from voting. So they're going to create lots of restrictions about voting, which will include some things that sound fairly reasonable, like a literacy test, because we do want to make sure if you're voting that you can read, but it's not a standard test, so it varies by whoever is receiving the test. and whoever's giving the test. So they make sure that if you're Black, you don't pass the literacy test. And they also pass a poll tax, P-O-L-L tax. So every time you vote, you have to pay a tax to vote. And if you didn't vote the first time you could vote, then you have to pay the tax retroactively. So back to the time when you first were supposed to pay the tax. And I know some of you are thinking, well, weren't there a bunch of poor, illiterate white guys in the South? Absolutely. There's a bunch of poor, illiterate, everybody, everywhere during this time period. But they passed something called a grandfather clause, which says if your grandfather could vote before the Civil War, then you don't have to pay the poll tax or pass the literacy test. So it's a free pass for poor white guys that couldn't read. And I know some of you are thinking, I know how we got mixed race slaves. So I know that some slaves, former slaves, had a grandfather who could vote before the Civil War. You are correct. However, they're not going to be recorded on anybody's birth certificate. And it's also part of the reason when you look at birth records of slaves versus not slaves in the South, that on slave birth records, their mother's name is recorded, but not always their father's. And the opposite, you know, with not slave birth records, they always recorded the father and the mother. So that way you can trace the slave lineage through the father. And I don't know, it's all sad, and yeah, it is sad. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing for a sec. All right, I'm gonna look to see what other questions you have. All right. All right. Okay. Is there anything you guys want to ask at this moment? Gosh, I left my other phone on too. That's not cool. All right. So I think, I don't know. I worry a little that I'm talking too much. So I had thought I would put up like this little matching thing and you could try to match stuff while I took roll, but I don't know. Do you want to? I'll put it up there. You guys look at it while I take roll. And we'll see how I do with taking roll. Goodness. Okay. Share the screen. If you end up liking the matching thing, I'll share it with you. I don't know. Let me just give you one page of the matching thing, maybe. There we go, one page. Oh, it's so small. All right. All right. Now, this is just kind of detailed stuff from the reading. So if you guys want to look at that for a second while I take roll and see if you know who any of those people are, and then we'll go over. Frederick Douglass, he's my favorite guy in U.S. history almost. He's right up there with Abraham Lincoln. They were friends. So, all right. Oh no, I just closed it, didn't I? I'm so sorry. Okay. All right, can you see the matching thing?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. But now I'm not feeling smart about if I take it down. Okay. All right. Can you still see the matching thing?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Sorry again about the, you know what I'm sorry about. It's that technology thing. All right. I'm going to try really quick to take roll on. I forgot that my little Blackboard thing allows me to take roll. So I'm going to try to do it there. You guys look at the matching thing for about 2 minutes. Go to the bathroom. Go get a Coke Zero, whatever you need. Go talk to your kid, whatever you need to do. Okay. This isn't going to work at all. I have to do the screenshot thing. Goodness. All right. I'm definitely going to do the screenshot thing. So, do you know who any of those people are? These are from the textbook. Now, again, I'm going to give you guys a list of what you should study. And again, I'll either publish that tonight or tomorrow, so you can kind of get started on it. And definitely not all these guys will be on here. And there's going to be 8 to 10 questions per unit. So there'll be, 3 or 4 per chapter. And if I were going to put any of these guys in the list of, which I don't know. Some of these guys are pretty important. I assume you know who Andrew Johnson is. Charles Sumner was Secretary of something, War, I think. Secretary of War? There he is. I ruined that for you, didn't I? Yeah, he's a guy that is going to help Andrew Johnson get impeached. So, Johnson was president. And I assume, let's see, who else would you know? Now, Stanton was the Secretary of War. Did I say Sumner? Crud. Sumner was the dude that got his head beaten in the Sumner-Brooks thing as they argued about ending slavery. He'd be a radical Republican senator from Massachusetts. He got his head beaten in during a Senate session. I know you guys worry that our Congress is nutty right now, and you're correct, but they usually don't beat each other's heads in. That's kind of crazy, isn't it? Whiskey Ring. Who did they give
Yeah,
the whiskey?
wasn't he in a coma for like 4 months or something like that?
He was, yeah. He had to convalesce for quite a while. And then his constituents just voted him back in because it's like, we're not going to let some dude who beat the crap out of our senator decide who our senator is. And then the Brooks fellow broke his cane. Yep, that's the one. Yeah. The Brooks fellow broke his cane over Charles Sumner's head. And his constituents sent him either new canes or somebody sent him a whip with an engraved gold handle that said something like, use this next time, it won't break. So, and apparently what had happened is Charles Sumner was a really staunch abolitionist, and he's making a speech in the joint session of Congress, and he's talking about how evil the South is and about how, they caused the evil of slavery, and people like Preston Brooks, who was another senator from South Carolina, or no, it wasn't Preston Brooks. It was Brooks's uncle was a senator. Brooks was a congressman. So people like, I can't remember who it was, but that guy from South Carolina owned slaves and brought evil on the country. So then Preston Brooks, the Brooks part of Sumner Brooks, decided to avenge the honor of his uncle by beating the crap out of Charles Sumner. And, yeah, cracked his head and split his skull a little. So he went and convalesced for a while and he came back. I mean, he's serving in Congress in the time period we're talking about. He outlives Lincoln, but he's not the same afterwards as you might imagine. All right. So I don't know. Let's see. We can scroll down and see the key, but let's see. Hiram Revels, I think he's the guy that stole the ship during the Civil War. I think he was the one, but maybe not. God. But most of these guys, I mean, they're famous in their era, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful to any of them. You got one of the I want women to vote people in there, national women stuff. And not that there weren't men that wanted women to vote, but she's, the most vocal. Frederick Douglass was big on women's voting rights too. So, but do you want to see the key? Was that distressing to you not to see it? Or you don't care? I can put this in the course documents too if you want to see the stuff as well. All right, so I'll scroll down because I really just put it at the bottom. I apologize. I should have thought of a better way to do this. So maybe we can I copy it and just put it up there? We'll see. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. If I'm making you dizzy, I apologize. Was not my goal. All right, so there we go. So Benjamin Turner, Congressman, and 2 is C. presidential, that's interesting. And then 3 is J, definitely. 4 is H. Yeah, I wouldn't have known who Carl Schurz was. Sorry, Carl. 5 is L. All right, so I'll leave that up for just a second if you would like to see that, and I'll stop talking about it. Although I should probably take the screenshot because I said I was going to. So.
Will this be on a test?
No. No, no. I don't know if I've made it very clear. Let me go ahead and stop sharing. I don't know if I've made it very clear how you're being assessed, because we go over that the first days, and I will put it in the course document. And I know the first day we go over everything, and so you don't remember stuff. And it does say in the syllabus if you forget, but your assessment, how you get points for the class, you have the weekly question, which you already know ahead of time, so you just prepare that, and you should be fine on that as long as you're thorough and you don't cheat. So that's good, and that's about half of your points. The other half of your points are unit quizzes or tests, if you want to look at them that way. That will happen every 3 or 4 weeks, and they'll happen the same time that your weekly questions are due. So around I think it's the 18th, it's a Friday, so the 18th of September. And so I'll make a quiz and I'll post it, and it'll have 8 to 10 questions. So it'll be like 3 or 4 from each chapter at the most. And so I'm going to pick stuff that I think is pretty important. I'm also going to post, like I said, either tonight or tomorrow, a list of things you would probably want to study to prepare for that. Now, those are going to necessarily be different than your weekly question. For me, the weekly question is like, that's the biggest thing that I want you to get from that chapter, which is why next time we're going to just talk about the weekly question, because I think that's the biggest deal. Was Reconstruction a success or failure? So the quiz part will be multiple choice, maybe short answer. Your first one's all multiple choice. And it's really just a few more details, but just a few, because, I didn't want to give you a 50 question version of this online for a variety of reasons, because I'm not sure it's a fair assessment, because honestly, I can't monitor it. And 2, I don't know if you have, we normally do tests in class. So you just come to class and we take a test. And, now I'm taking up your class time, lecturing, that kind of stuff. So I don't know how much time you have to set aside for the assessment. Plus, it's not like you can go somewhere and take the test. So just trying to figure out the best way to give you as much information as you need without overdoing it, but you still get the big main idea. I don't know. So your assessment are the weekly questions, and then the short quizzes, 8 to 10 questions that you get about every 3 to 4 weeks. And you'll get a study list for those, which I'll give you again tonight or tomorrow. Okay. So your quiz part is going to be short. It is. And after the first one, if I'll ask you, like, do you like it? Do you want something bigger? I won't give you anything smaller, but I could give you something in a different format. But I'll ask you after the first one what you thought about it. I will say that over the summer, nobody seemed to object too much about that. They didn't necessarily like the weekly question part, but, I don't know. At least you have those ahead of time. All right, is there anything else you want to ask before we hit the second half of this?
No, I'm good.
Okay, thank you. And hopefully, if you ask a question in an email, I would answer it. I know I overlooked somebody's. Hopefully it wasn't any of yours, but I apologize. It was not my goal. All right, so yeah, you notice too, the notes for this are pretty short, but I think we'll have a good discussion next time about, is Reconstruction a success or a failure? So one of the things you'll notice if you read through the chapter pretty thoroughly, or if you just know stuff about Andrew Johnson, his presidency did not go very well. He mostly just fought with Congress. He's going to veto more bills than all of the other presidents combined before him, although Andrew Jackson did that as well. It's just there hadn't been that many presidents before him. So maybe it's just we can't elect people named Andrew. I don't know. But some of you liked Andrew Jackson. I know. So I'm sorry. I don't mean to dish your favorite president. But Andrew Johnson's just going to fight with Congress. And Congress is super irritated with him, and they would like to get rid of him because everything they pass that they think is important, he vetoes. Now, Congress is also going to override his vetoes more than anyone's ever been overridden. Now, you know what a veto is, I assume, but if you don't, that's cool. Congress passes a law, and then the president has to sign that to become a law. So if the president signs it, then it becomes a law. If he doesn't, he can veto it, or he can just not sign it. And then it either becomes a law in most of the time, or the last 10 days doesn't become a law. But a veto is like, heck no, this is a terrible idea. So Johnson, heck knows this is a terrible idea. Lots and lots of laws that Congress passes. And most of these laws have to do with improvements in the South, rights for former slaves, funding of the Freedmen's Bureau, that sort of thing. So Congress will then try to override his veto. And to pass a law, you just need 50%, or a majority, simple majority, one vote over 50%. But to override a veto, you need a 2/3 vote. And those are generally very hard to come by. Like right now, it would be very hard for 2/3 of our Congress to agree on anything. I mean, it just would. They can't even pass, bills that you would think are no-brainers, like, another or stimulus package or something, which most everybody thinks is probably a good idea, but they're fighting about and probably won't pass it. In this era, the reason they're able to override Johnson with regularity is the South isn't getting to put people into the legislature. So the people who are voting to override laws are people all from the North. And I'm not saying that everybody from the North hated Andrew Johnson, but Johnson is clearly operating in the interests of the South. And the North may not necessarily agree with the more radical members of the Republican Party who really wanted to end slavery, some of whom really truly thought blacks and whites were equal and should be treated equal under the law. Most people are not that radical during this time period, but their choices are, let's be with the radical Republicans or let's be with Andrew Johnson. There's really not much middle ground. In that way, it is kind of similar to modern politics, I think. Although I would never argue that the stakes are quite as large as they were maybe post-Civil War, but I don't know. But politics were so polarized during this time period that there really is no middle. There's no moderate anything. So you're either with Johnson or you're with the Congress. So, and there's not many Southern representatives in Congress. There's not very many people who agree very often with Andrew Johnson. So it's fairly easy to override his veto. However, they were still annoyed with him because he kept vetoing their stuff. So he thought, how can we get rid of this guy? Let's impeach him. Now, nobody had tried to impeach a president yet. We'd impeached some judges before, but mostly because they were drunk at work, which is not good. Not good, in case you were ever wondering. So, the only time they'd ever impeached anybody were federal judges for misconduct that they could prove. So the laws, the Constitution says that you have to be guilty of a high crime or misdemeanor, which doesn't sound like a high crime, but something. So you have to break a law to be impeached. Well, Johnson's super irritating. He vetoes a bunch of stuff. He regularly goes to Congress and cusses them out, but he doesn't break laws. He's just irritated. So they knew they'd have to pass a law that he would break. So they set him up to impeach him. So they decide they're going to pass a law called the Tenure of Office Act. Oh, I forgot to mention, sorry. And this actually, yeah, you'll see this in one of the matching ones. The North really does want former slaves to vote, but it's because they'll vote for Republicans. They'll vote for people from the North. And that way, when the Southern states get reconstructed, there'll be a Black voting contingent that always votes for Republicans, which is true for African Americans up until 1932. If Black men were voting, they always voted for Republicans because it was the party of Lincoln, and Lincoln freed the slaves. So that's true until 1932. Because I know some of you are going like, that is not true anymore. You are correct. If you are going to look at percentages, African Americans, as a rule, do not vote for Republicans. I know, I saw the convention. I know that that's not true for everybody, but percentage-wise it is. That changes in 1932, which we'll clearly talk about later. But the North wants Black men in the South voting because they'll vote for Republicans, or because they want them to have equal rights, which is true occasionally, but usually not. The KKK, you've heard of them, they form in the South for a variety of reasons, none of them nice, and they want to suppress Black voters, and they're quite successful at that. So Congress will pass some laws called the Force Act or the Enforcement Act, or the nickname is the KKK Act, so that Southern governors in those 5 military districts can call in federal troops to protect Black voters and to suppress the KKK, which they will do pretty regularly during the Johnson administration and the first Grant administration. But they won't do it as often in the second Grant administration. And by the end of the second Grant administration, Grant just tells them, look, you're on your own, good luck to you. So as time goes along during this period of Reconstruction, at the beginning part in the Johnson era, Congress is like, we hate Johnson. We want to make sure Black men in the South are protected so they can vote. So they're going to enforce a lot of these laws. As time goes along, they're less committed to it for a variety of reasons that we'll continue to discuss. Okay, so back to Johnson. Johnson's annoying, so Congress says, let's get rid of him, but he doesn't break laws, so we got to pass a law that he'll break. So they passed something called the Tenure of Office Act. Tenure of Office Act. Did I even write that in? Oh, it's right there, sorry. All right, so Abraham Lincoln's former Secretary of War was still part of Johnson's cabinet. Johnson didn't pick a new cabinet, and he wanted to, most of them end up resigning, but the one that was left was Edwin Stanton. And Edwin Stanton is a super radical Republican, which, I mean, most people look at it and go like, man, I admire that. He's a man ahead of his time. He really thinks Blacks and whites are equal. He's also, in other ways, not friendly. We'll just go with that. He's hard to work with. And in the middle of the Civil War, he had an interview with a reporter where he told, and I've already proclaimed to you that I don't swear, but I'm quoting, so I'll say that it's legit in this case, where he proclaimed to a reporter that he was really frustrated with Abraham Lincoln, and he thought he was an ass. He said, the president is an ass. And so the reporter then was interviewing Abraham Lincoln, and he says, we were just speaking with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and he has said that you are an ass. And he said, well, the Secretary of War is rarely wrong, so perhaps I am. He even gave Lincoln fits. But I mean, Lincoln valued his opinion and you know, needed him for certain things. Johnson doesn't value his opinion, doesn't want him around at all. He won't quit just out of spite. So Johnson says, I'm going to get rid of this guy. So the Tenure of Office Act essentially says you can't fire Edwin Stanton without Senate approval. Now, it's not really about Edwin Stanton. It says that you can't fire anyone who was confirmed by the Senate, which a cabinet level official would be, without Senate approval. So the Senate had to approve him for him to be hired. So the Senate also has to approve him for him to be fired. Now, Johnson thinks, well, that's not really constitutional, so that's not going to pass. it did pass. Johnson vetoes it, and then they override Johnson's veto, and then Johnson fires Edwin Stanton. So then they impeach him. Now, impeach is bring charges against and have a trial to consider whether you're going to kick him out of office or not. So he gets impeached, but not convicted. So they bring the articles of impeachment against him in the House. They hold the trial in the Senate. The Senate impeachment managers negotiate with Johnson's attorneys, and they say, look, Johnson's going to back off and be a little more reasonable the last 6 or 8 months of his presidency. So if you'll just vote against kicking him out, he'll calm down. So 5 or 6, I think it was 6 Republican senators decide to vote against kicking him out so he doesn't get kicked out of office. And then, you know, the last 6 or 8 months of Johnson's presidency are fairly peaceful, fairly peaceful. So he gets impeached, but not convicted. And as I've probably mentioned, the Force Acts or Enforcement Acts or KKK Acts do get used a lot in the Johnson term and the first Grant term. After Johnson's presidency, he doesn't run for a second term, but oddly enough, he runs for Congress. He runs for Senate again and gets elected. And so he's seated in the Senate and he gets an ovation, and then they ask him if he wants to give a speech, and he gives a speech where he cusses them out for impeaching him because he's Johnson. That's what he does. Grant becomes president, and that's kind of a no-brainer because, you know, military service, we honor that. Plus, you know, he was the victorious general in the Civil War, and he's an honorable fellow. I know, you read that he drank too much. He had moments, but not while he was president. He figured that out long before. He's like George Bush in that way, the younger one, not the older one. I don't want to, you know, harm his reputation. But you may have heard George Bush, the younger president, had issues with alcohol, but his solution was stop drinking. So he didn't, which is why nobody liked his parties, because they didn't serve alcohol. But Grant had similar issues in his younger years and stopped drinking as he got older. So whatever problems he had as a young dude, he had less as he got older. I know somebody typed a question. Lincoln was, yeah, Lincoln's pretty stubborn. He was. And I think Lincoln kind of kept his eyes on the prize, as it were. You know, it didn't matter to him that his cabinet was fighting, that there were, you know, political issues. He had to solve those issues, but he kept focused on reuniting the Union, ending slavery, you know, what his goals were. And, you know, he was also, as most people were during that time period, fairly religious type person. So he believed that he kind of had a mission and he needed to accomplish it, which, you know, I guess that sounds military as well. You can do both, right? Okay. Yeah, donkey also. Yeah, that's true. That is true, isn't it? Yeah, I'm from Missouri and our state animal is a mule. So I think it's for that reason. All right. I think I'll stop sharing for a sec because we're pretty close to the time where we should be done. And I know we haven't covered Grant. I know it seems weird that Grant gets 2 terms and we just don't care about him. But we don't as much as we should. Grant, personally, like super honorable kind of dude, but he has a cabinet that's a little dishonest, and you'll see a whole lot of scamming going on during the Grant administration, mostly about reconstruction contracts, money, that sort of stuff. Railroad contracts, because we're building the Transcontinental Railroad. Or no, they've just finished that up, but there's more railroads that we're building. So there's a bunch of government contracts floating around during that time period. So there's lots of money to be had, and people are looking for it. So yeah, kind of messy. So we'll talk about a little bit of government corruption in the next era and in the next presidency. Grant gets 2 terms. Now, by the end of the second term, he's ill. So he's probably a little more distracted and is not paying as close attention to things, I guess, as he should be or could be. And his goal, I don't know, I know at least one of you probably has an opinion about this, but they don't pay the military very well. I'm guessing more than one of you has an opinion, but I'm sure at least one of you has an opinion about this. They don't pay the military very well. So Grant had a military retirement and a family, and he was dying. He had cancer. He wasn't doing very well. So he needed to try to provide for his family. And that was his main concern. So he's writing his memoirs during the second half of his term. So he gets distracted a little, and he gets a little, I don't know, sidetracked, as he should, because he wants to make sure his family's taken care of. And he dies pretty quickly after his presidency. And I don't know, there's a new book about Grant, if, for some reason you're super excited about that. I can't remember who wrote it. And it's new, by new, I mean in the last 2 years, because if you study much of military history, which admittedly is not my thing, but sorry for those of you that like it. Usually military historians talk a lot about how they really respect Robert E. Lee. He graduated second in his class. He's a much better field general, that kind of stuff. And Grant's kind of a bumbling sort of dude. But really the new history, should I say new history? But the more detailed studies of Grant suggest that Grant is really a general who's worth honoring as well. So I think, at least when I went to school, it's like, Lee is great, Grant's just a drunk guy that got lucky. That's not an accurate portrayal at all. And that makes sense too, because you couldn't win a war like that probably just because you got lucky. You surely couldn't win it if you were drunk. Yeah, I'm just sure of that. So, all right. Do you guys have any questions you would like to ask before we go, since I went on my Grant was not drunk talk? Although at some point he was, just not during his presidency or the Civil War. Are there any questions, concerns, anything you want to know about grades or when I'm going to post stuff, or do you have any trouble finding recordings? Everybody good? Speaking of, I think I'll stop the recording here in a sec. Okay. All right. All right. So, yeah, if you have any questions, you can stay behind and ask. I think I'll go ahead and stop the recording then.